High above the sprawling spires of the citadel of Ethelgard, the private chambers of Imperator Vespera remain wrapped in deliberate silence. Kalen sat perfectly still inside the humming perimeter of the containment field. It was an elegant trap. The energy grid shimmered with the faint, cold light of distant constellations, casting long shadows across the polished obsidian floor. He had been here since the ambush of his ship, the Void Runner. The Valorian court believed they had captured a primitive, a voiceless, exotic trophy stripped from the wreckage of the Outer Rim. Vespera stood on the far side of the room. She held a crystal glass of deep amber, swirling liquor. The sovereign of the Valorian Empire did not gloat. She simply watched him. The liquid caught the ambient light, now reflecting an intelligence that was calculating his precise value. She assumed he was deaf to the intricate, lethal politics of her world. She was wrong. Kalen understood every syllable of xenolinguistics spoken in her presence. He was the perfect, invisible witness to a collapsing empire. But how long can a captive hold his tongue before the silence becomes deadlier than the truth? The days bled into a rhythm of silent observation. Kalen learned the invisible architecture of Ethelgard without ever leaving his gilded cage. Vespera used her private chambers to hold clandestine meetings with her highest-ranking officials. They spoke freely around the human pet. They discussed trade routes, fleet deployments, and the rapidly growing shadow of Commander Drusus. Drusus was a usurper disguised as a loyalist. Kalen listened to the commander's allies subtly test Vespera's defenses, mapping the precise fractures in her military support. Kalen sat on the cushioned floor of his enclosure. He cataloged every name and every whispered treason. He was a voiceless prisoner. No, he was a highly classified intelligence asset. He corrected the thought instantly. The distinction mattered. It was the only thing keeping his mind sharp while his body remained confined. He watched Vespera navigate the treacherous conversations with lethal grace. Her biology fascinated him. Whenever Drusus was mentioned, the microscopic, metallic-hued dermal ridges along Vespera's jawline would flatten against her skin. It was an involuntary thermal response to predatory stress. She knew Drusus was a threat. She just did not know how close the blade hovered to her neck. The deception required flawless discipline. He had to suppress every human instinct to react, ensuring that when a Valorian general insulted his species, his breathing remained entirely steady. And when Vespera detailed a tactical maneuver that would leave her eastern flank exposed, his eyes remained completely vacant. But discipline is fragile under the weight of constant isolation. The fracture happened over something utterly trivial. A low-ranking servant had entered the chambers to replace the nutrient trays near the containment field. The servant was young and clearly terrified of the Imperator's quarters. He fumbled the heavy silver tray. It slipped from his trembling hands, clattering violently against the floor. Without thinking, Kalen shifted forward. Vaishna, Kalen murmured softly. It was a simple Valorian word of steadying comfort. The servant froze. The silence that followed was absolute. Kalen realized his mistake the moment the syllable left his lips. He had spoken the forbidden language. For a human to possess this knowledge was an implicit threat to the Empire. It carried an automatic sentence of execution. Vespera had just entered the room. She stood perfectly still in the arched doorway, her eyes locked onto Kalen. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop as her dermal ridges flared in sudden, sharp synchronization. It was the Valorian biological marker of profound shock. She dismissed the servant with a single flick of her wrist. Within the hour, the containment field was deactivated. Two heavily armed guards escorted Kalen through the cavernous, vaulted corridors of the Citadel. When they did not take him to the detention levels, they brought him to the empty throne room. The vast chamber was bathed in the harsh, unrelenting light of the midday sun. Vespera sat on the elevated dais. She was holding the same glass of swirling amber liquor, though she did not take a sip. She waited until the guards withdrew and the heavy ironwood doors sealed shut behind them. "Speak," she commanded. The single word resonated in the hollow space. Kalen stood at the base of the dais. He felt a profound, contradictory wave of emotion wash over him. A cold, rational dread of his new proximity to the Empire's deadliest apex predator gripped his chest. Yet layered entirely over that fear was an undeniable magnetic fascination with her ruthless efficiency. He was no longer a pet looking at a master, nor he was an operative standing before a sovereign. "Your eastern flank is vulnerable," Kalen said in flawless Valorian. "Commander Drusus is staging a blockade under the guise of a routine patrol." Vespera did not move. Her gaze remained fixed on him. While the fate of his life hung in the unbearable silence, Kalen found his eyes drifting downward. He noticed a singular asymmetric scratch on the gilded armrest of Vespera's throne. It caught the harsh, ambient light perfectly. It was a tiny, jagged imperfection in a room designed to project absolute, flawless power. He wondered what weapon had caused it. He wondered how long the Imperator had been sitting beside it without ordering it repaired. "You hid your fluency to spy on my court," Vespera stated. It was not a question. It was a precise assessment of fact. "I gathered intelligence to survive," Kalen replied. "And right now my survival is directly tied to yours." She set the glass of amber liquor down on a small marble table. The heavy clink echoed sharply. She descended the steps of the dais, moving with the fluid, predatory grace native to her species. When she stopped, she was close enough that Kalen could feel the ambient heat radiating from her skin. Valorian baseline temperatures ran significantly higher than a human's. It felt like standing next to a banked furnace. "A pet is a luxury," Vesper said softly. "An asset is a weapon. I do not execute weapons." She ordered him outfitted in the dark, structured attire of the Valorian nobility. The transformation took hours. The heavy fabrics and high reinforced collars felt restrictive against his skin, and they replaced the degrading simplicity of his captive garments with a different kind of weight. He was no longer confined to the grid. He was being woven into the very fabric of the court. He was an unspoken alliance hidden in plain sight, elevated from the floor of a cage to the immediate shadow of the throne. As he adjusted the heavy metal clasps of his new uniform, Kalen realized the true nature of his changing status. He was a human walking freely in the citadel of Ethelgard. The danger had not disappeared. It had simply changed forms. The transition from captive to asset required a fundamental recalibration of his senses. Kalen spent the following week standing in the shadows of the Citadel's most exclusive chambers. The dark, restrictive collars of his noble attire bruised his neck, a constant physical reminder of his precarious new reality. He learned to read the Violorian court not by what they said, but by what their biology betrayed. He noted how Lord Valen's bioluminescent pulse quickened when trade tariffs were discussed. He memorized the exact shift in atmospheric pressure when the royal guard entered a room. He became an unparalleled instrument of observation. Vespera utilized him with a terrifying, calculated efficiency. She brought him to strategy meetings where generals openly debated troop movements, assuming the human was merely an exotic piece of furniture. Kalen would stand perfectly still for hours. Later, in the profound isolation of her private quarters, he would recount every whispered vulnerability, every subtle shift in loyalty. Their dynamics shifted into something entirely unprecedented. It was a dangerous symbiotic exchange of power. She provided the absolute protection of the throne. He provided the unvarnished truth of her empire. The tension reached its breaking point on the eve of the solar eclipse. The grand banquet hall of the Citadel was a suffocating theater of calculated indulgence, where bioluminescent delicacies illuminated the sharp, predatory smiles of high-ranking officials who masked their shifting thermal signatures beneath layers of heavy, restrictive ceremonial silk while plotting open treason. Kalen stood flush against the obsidian pillar just behind the sovereign's seat. He was no longer a curiosity in a cage. He was the invisible knife held casually in her hand. The Valorian lords ignored him completely. They saw only the dark, structured attire of a favored servant. Their arrogance was a structural flaw he exploited with every passing minute. Vespera sat at the apex of the crescent table. Her dermal ridges were perfectly smooth, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying calm. She did not look at him. She did not need to. They had established an unspoken alliance built on micro-gestures. A slight tilt of her chin meant he should memorize a face. A slow blink meant a speaker was lying. Tonight the air was saturated with a sharp metallic tang of Valorian adrenaline. It was the scent of a predator preparing to strike. Commander Drusus sat 3 seats to her left. The usurper was heavily armored in ceremonial plating that subtly clicked with his every breath. Kalen watched the commander's hands. He watched the micro-expressions of the loyalists seated around him. A covert physical exchange happened in the span of a heartbeat. A small, heavy metallic cylinder passed from a serving attendant into the commander's open palm. He mapped the trajectory from Drusus's right hand to the sovereign's exposed neck, calculating the exact milliseconds required for a pulse weapon to clear its holster. But the entire tactical projection evaporated into static the moment Vespera's gaze cut directly through the crowded hall to lock onto his. She knew the trap was springing. The detonation shattered the vaulted ceiling of the banquet hall. Huge chunks of gilded masonry rained down into the feast. The concussive wave knocked the high-ranking officials to the floor in a brutal tangle of limbs and screaming panic. Kalen was already moving before the suffocating dust could settle. Because survival. Drusus rose from the center of the chaos with terrifying calculated speed. His heavy ceremonial armor unsealed with a sharp hiss, shedding the restrictive outer plates to reveal the lightweight, lethal combat chassis beneath. He barked a guttural command in Valorian. A dozen hidden loyalists drew their weapons simultaneously, executing the royal guard in a coordinated crossfire. Vespera moved with lethal, fluid precision. She vaulted the crescent table, her bioluminescent markings flaring into a blinding, violent violet. She struck the first 2 assassins with a localized kinetic burst, sending their broken bodies crashing through the obsidian pillars. But the sheer volume of the ambush forced her forward, pulling her away from her remaining heavily armored guard. She was entirely exposed. Drusus flanked her position perfectly. He stepped calmly over the bodies of fallen nobles. As Commander Drusus raised his pulse weapon to Imperator Vespera's unprotected back, Kalen lunged across the blood-slicked marble, throwing a scavenged blade to rewrite the fate of the Empire. During his desperate slide across the floor, his eyes briefly fixated on a discarded silver serving platter. It spun flawlessly on its rim for 3 impossible seconds, singing a high, clear note before finally clattering flat against the stone. The concealed blade struck Drusus precisely in the vulnerable, unarmored joint of his weapon arm. The commander's arm dropped instantly. His primary thermal regulators ruptured under the impact, spewing superheated vapor into the cold air. Drusus staggered backward, his vocal cords emitting a harsh, grating static of biological shock. Vespera spun around at the sudden hiss of vapor. She saw the disabled usurper clutching his arm. She saw the human operative rising from the floor. Without a single word of hesitation, she closed the distance and drove her energy pike straight through the commander's chest. Blood coated the floor. In the quiet, devastating aftermath of the Purge Rebellion, Vespera stood amidst the wreckage. She formally offered him a transport ship and absolute, unconditional freedom. He did not leave. Kalen refused the departure codes, taking a permanent place at her right side. Beside the throne, a single glass of amber liquor sat untouched, catching the light of a new, unbroken empire.